Thanks a million, Karen. That's great. That's a lot. That's a lot of visits. What was it, 80, 79, nearly 80 visits over the last year and a half.
I know, 79 in total. I know,
good.
it's brilliant.
Very good.
Yes.
It's been good fun. It's been great fun to go.
Yeah, I think so too.
Okay, so keep it for under an hour. So I better jump in fairly quickly because I have a tendency to dig deeper into the conversation than I should do. So without further ado, let's look at the context and the aims for the Hare's Corner ponds. So just very, very briefly, this is a very old slide I took at the beginning of my wetland work in the late 1990s, mid 1990s, of a boggy corner of a field in East Cork. And one of the contexts for the Hare's Corner is that as habitats like this are removed, we lose the habitat for wildlife, and we also lose the resilience in the wider landscape, that water storage. Basically, water will store within habitats of boggy corners or wetlands or marshy spots on fields or, even hedgerows, and it'll store the water and soak it up like a sponge and then release it gently afterwards. And the problem is that we've removed a lot of these, partly driven by CAP, partly driven by wanting to get more production out of the land. But the challenge is that once they're gone, we lose that landscape resilience. And this is a photograph of the Limerick Road in Ennis with the floodwaters from 2011 spilling out of St. Clement's College and out onto the Limerick Road. That wall is about 4 foot high, something along those lines, and it's half submerged in water. And you can see the brand new computer buildings also submerged in the background there. The main building was fine. They obviously knew how to build when they called Ennis, the Irish for an island. So, you'd think that staying out of the floodplains would be a sensible thing to do. But one of the challenges is that as we remove all of those habitats, we remove that resilience from within the landscape. And the corollary is that when the rain stops again, we end up with drought conditions. And that can obviously be serious for agriculture if there's not enough moisture in the fields, but also if you're a fish, it's suddenly catastrophic because your home is basically been gone. You've been shoved out and forcibly evicted with absolutely nowhere else to go. So these are major issues for the wider landscape. And so one of the things that the Hare's Corner endeavours to do is to bring back in habitats around the country that wildlife can begin to live in again. And there's other issues that are associated with the clearing of habitats or not so much the clearing of habitats, but there's other impacts on wildlife around the country. You can see here algal growth on a stream flowing into Lough Corrib, and that's the algae will grow as a result of nitrogen and phosphorus in the water. So if there's too many nutrients getting in, that poses direct problems for wildlife as well. Similarly, runoff from roads can carry diesel and oil and spilled milk, even just silt, earth, all of that. That will all have a direct bearing on the health of the waterway. And so as we look at water quality in Ireland over the last 20 odd years, 30 years, we can see that there's a steady decline in seriously polluted waterways, which is a very, very good thing. But there's also a steady decline in high quality waters. They've almost halved in that time, which is actually a huge reduction at a time when we're gaining greater awareness of environmental protections and the importance of biodiversity. To still be losing our high quality waters is pretty catastrophic. So what we can do with the Hare's Corner is begin to bring back in those habitats and to provide that resilience within the landscape. And here we can see in County Clare, we can see the Q values for the different rivers and streams around the country, so around the county. So there's one red one down here. That looks like it's coming in. Is that close to Carrigaholt? No, not quite. One seriously polluted river within that time. Quite a lot of blue dots, which are high quality. A scatter of greens, which are good. A scatter of yellow, which is moderate. Orange, which is poor. And just one red one there in the southwest. So this is a general overview of the quality of our watercourses within the county. And to my mind, it's not really enough. I mean, really the Water Framework Directive requires the Clare County Council to reach good quality, I think, for all rivers and streams by 2027. And we're not really on target for that. So that's briefly looking at water quality. Another thing that I want to mention very briefly is that the insect population over the last 20, 30, 40 years has absolutely plummeted. it's really been decimated. If we look at these figures, let's take July, these are German figures. There is 900 grams of insects collected in a particular location, particular nature reserve in 1989. And in the same location, in the same month, a good number of years later, we're down to just over 150 grams. So there's been a massive plunge of insect health. And you can see that for each month. So you can see that in July, you'd have the maximum number of insects anyway. So there's a steady rise and fall of insect populations throughout the calendar year. But you can see the way they've absolutely fallen through the floor. Now, if you think, well, okay, great. I don't like being bitten by horseflies. Do you know, I don't either. That's, surely it's great that there's fewer horseflies. The challenge is that not only horseflies, but all of the other insects that are there provide the very, very basis for the food chain, for birds and for frogs, for reptiles, for, you know, a whole host of species, which then go on to feed other things. So the base of your food chain is being completely eroded. And as the rug gets pulled out from under our food chain, who knows where that will stop? Homo sapiens, that's our species, we're an apex predator. We're essentially high up at the top of the food chain. And if we pull the rug from under the very, very base of the food chain, then where do we end up? And we don't necessarily see it with insects as clearly for our species, but if you apply the same thing to krill and zooplankton and the like in the oceans, and all of those other species that are also at the base of the food chain being wiped out, where does that stop? When does our food simply run out? And so what the Hare's Corner aims to do is to provide wildlife ponds. And one of the things that can be really, really constructive for is aquatic insects. So there are things that can be done about that. Urban suds, green roofs, rain harvesting, stormwater wetlands, swales. There's a whole raft of things that can be done to filter water running off urban areas. Now, if your urban area is your local village, or if it's just your own roof, there are things that can be done. And I'm adding in a certain number of slides here that you can refer to afterwards if you wish. I'm not going to go through everything. I'll keep it more focused on the ponds. So for example, an open swale or a pond behaves like this. Your stormwater rushes down the pipe from the housing estate, bringing silt and grit and whatever else. And as soon as you open up that pipe, suddenly you begin to get interesting things happening. You get the silt settling out, you get algae beginning to grow and mopping up nitrates and phosphates, plants encroaching to slow down the flow of the water, all of those good things occurring if you just get away from piped infrastructure and open that out into an open swale or into a pond. And so that can be very, very constructive. Similarly, on a farm scale, there's lots of different buffer zone types that can be used in channel wetlands and ponds and the like. Habitat reinstatement is a fantastic farm scale solution for lots of water quality issues. Even farming practices within the fields themselves. Dams can be employed along drains and the like, and there's a number of working examples, not least of which are the Irish EIPs, of which the Hare's Corner is a part. So an example of a farm scale swale, here we have a system, it was just a drain basically in North Cork that was widened and made shallow and then planted up, and that's the same drain a year later, showing an abundance of plant growth, filtering the water, slowing it down. And for this particular farmer, he wanted to get the owls back that were there when he was a child. And this is one of the ways that he's trying to improve his farm to help the wider habitats for owls. So coming back to ponds, let's look at design and location. So we need to consider a number of factors as we ask the question about design and location. So what's the intended use for our pond? What do we want to do with it? And in the Hare's Corner context, wildlife is our primary focus, but there's lots of other potential uses that we could dovetail into as well. Size and shape. In terms of size, the Hare's Corner minimum size is 25 square meters for a pond, and the shape then should basically be as irregular as possible in order to maximize the edge, detail, and maximize the value for wildlife. The depth is an important one. If the water goes too deep, then you're not going to really get maximum value for wildlife. If you've got a sudden plunge down to 2 meters or 1.5 meters, it's not going to do a lot. If you can keep it really shallow and have very, very shallow grades at the edges, that can be really good for wildlife. Lining requirements are really important. County Clare is very interesting geologically. And in East Clare, when we were doing our visits, it was a dream. You roll in, you jump out of the car, and you go, okay, where is the water sitting anyway? And begin to look at that and see what, see where to put the pond, because the clay was so heavy. And so there was just so much water everywhere. Similarly, parts of West Clare can be likewise. North Clare, obviously, you've got the Burren and the limestone, and the water just vanishes into the ground. And then there's areas in between with mixed geology where sometimes you need a liner, sometimes you don't. Plants and planting, we'll look at that very, very briefly. The general advice for clean water ponds from the UK seems to be not to bother planting, just leave it alone, let it colonize itself, and then look at that in a bit. The location, where do we put the pond? The bottom of your garden is generally the easiest one because it's below your roof or your yard, or or sloping ground that can feed it. The top of the yard might be cleaner, so there's or the top of the garden might be cleaner. So the location is something we'll look at as well. Bank slope, the shallower the better. The water source, is that from simply runoff, or is it rainfall, or runoff from a driveway or a clean yard or fields? So that will have a bearing on the water quality and a bearing on how quickly your pond is topped up. So if you're trying to decide whether you need a liner or not, if you've got a lot of water coming in, you don't necessarily need a liner as much as if it's only rain-fed. Do you need planning permission? You do, basically, if it's more than 1 meter of a change in ground depth. Otherwise you don't. So with the Hare's Corner, we don't, because we stay within that limit. And liaison with official bodies of various sorts. Basically, digging within a stream channel requires permission from Inland Fisheries Ireland. So we'll avoid that. And then if you're building weirs or dams, then the OPW needs to grant a specific license. So that kind of thing we avoid, just partly to make sure we don't damage existing habitats. And then the ecological impact is very important. Are we building on a species-rich grassland, or is there an existing important wetland there, as it is, or are there deciduous woodlands that we need to avoid? Ideally, we build somewhere where, you've got relatively low-quality ground that is used for, marginal grazing or the like, that has been used for agriculture, but really isn't necessarily wonderful for farming either. So that you're taking back that land back for wildlife, that it may never have been turned into farmland if it wasn't for the Common Agricultural Policy really pushing you to be able to view everything from a satellite map. And there seem to be changes now in CAP, which might be more constructive going forward. So moving on from that, very briefly, this is a photograph of Andrew Millison, well worth a watch on YouTube. So let me see, oh, I took the wrong reference. But if you look up permaculture ponds, why, where, and how, Andrew Millison, you'll find a series of fantastic videos. So there's a number of different reasons why people might put in a pond. One is for groundwater recharge. One is for irrigation purposes. One is recreation, like a swimming pond or something. Firefighting ponds aren't as common in Ireland, but they're here. We do have them, around the country for industrial use. Habitat is where we're really focusing on for the Hare's Corner. Aquaculture is another possibility. So in permaculture, we often try to get many uses out of the one thing. So as we look at habitat as our primary focus, do we also want something that might double as, some irrigation for our polytunnel, or just sitting beside and watching the birds as a recreational area? There'll be benefits for groundwater recharge potentially if it's an online pond. Who knows, are there plants that we can grow as an aquaculture system rather than even fish, just to have what is it, bulrush, the Typha latifolia, or watercress, that type of thing in our ponds that we could pick if the water is clean enough. So there's lots of potential uses that are there. There's a project in the UK called the 1 Million Ponds Project, and they've got a series of fact sheets that are very, very useful. So this is just a brief overview of their fact sheets. I'm not going to go into detail with these. I'll look at some of them later. But what I'm going to do is we'll circulate these slides so you'll have all of these links afterwards. And you can refer to them then. So very briefly, the UK project is looking specifically at clean water ponds, whereas for years I've been looking at using ponds to clean water. So it's a kind of a different focus, but basically what they're pointing out is this potential nutrient sources from ploughed land, from grazed land, from houses. Now, an ideal place for a pond, for a clean water pond specifically, is somewhere that's off the main stream channel and not directly, not widening an existing pond, but possibly adding in a small pond close to an existing lake or close to an existing marsh habitat, but not overlapping with it. So you're adding to the species diversity within the area and the habitat diversity within the area. So ideally you dig them near other wetlands. Now, County Clare is generally wet enough to have lots of wetlands around anyway, even in the Burren. You see in these little pockets of limestone, tiny little rush plants growing out of their little pools. So there's basically wetland habitat all over the place. So wherever you dig, you're close enough to a wetland. And where uncommon species are, in order to be able to help spread their area, their habitat. So basically, don't dig them where there's existing wetland habitats if you can avoid it. Not dovetailing completely and overlapping. It's more to expand the wetland network. Don't dig it where it might damage existing species. The reason why you shouldn't dig up peat in this context is to avoid the carbon off-gassing from dry peat, and then being careful near archaeological sites, which is an important one as well. So when avoiding new sites, now we've looked at this, Karen and I have been at a number of sites, and we'll arrive and we'll look at the area where the pond is being proposed, and you just see this abundance of species already there and growing and really comfortable in the space. And so if the pond can be dug just beside that spring or just beside that flush, that seepage area with that rich species abundance, then you widen the habitat. So this kind of an example, putting a pond in beside the flush, beside that seep hole that's running down along the side of a field with lots of different species that aren't just ryegrass, rather than digging out that area itself and making that into a pond. And then if you can dig a pond with undulating edges, that's great. But if you can manage to make your pond complex such that you get seasonal pools around the edges, then so much the better. Basically, the more untidy it looks within reason, the more wildlife seems to enjoy it. The more edge length there is. If you were to go around and measure the edge length here, it's a lot less than the edge length all the way around here. So the more edge surface there is, the better it is for wildlife. And similarly, the slopes, rather than having it, now they say 1 in 3 is a steep slope. Generally, I've seen some of the ponds that are quite steeply sloping. If you can have a 1 in 10, even a 1 in 20, so very, very gentle sloping gradient around the pond edge, then that's fantastic for wildlife. You can see in cross section here, if you've got a gentle slope, they're regarding this as a steep slope in this particular context. But the more you can gentle out that slope, the more the pond area will rise and fall between seasons, and the more variety of habitats you'll have for plants and for animals. And so you get some plants when you've got an edge with maybe 1 in 3, but you get a lot more if you've got that wide, broad, undulating edge all the way around your pond. Just to keep that in mind when you're digging and excavating. Islands are another thing that a number of people have in their ponds. Now, one of the main keynotes in this, again, I'll circulate these, so don't worry too much about reading everything. The main thing that they recommend here is to make sure that the islands are kept low enough. They don't particularly want high trees coming in quickly because they can act as a roost site for crows, which then just sit there all day and wait until they see wader chicks and then just swoop down and pick them up and eat them. So that's not ideal. So if you can keep your islands low, so much the better from a wildlife perspective. Similarly, edge detail rather than a big rectangle, if you can have it nice and undulating all the way around, and rather than lots of deep area, if you can have it variable throughout your pond, that's so much the better. So the designs and drawings can be useful. You may or may not need them, but drawings can be useful. One of the things that they can do is they can give you a general idea of what it is that you want. So you can communicate, for a start, with your spouse, with the person who's sharing the garden with you. That can sometimes be very, very helpful if they're not, just to see, okay, are we imagining the same thing before we let one person loose with the digger driver, just to create havoc on our land here. Because after the work is done, the whole place can look like a sea of mud. It can look a little bit dispiriting, even though the open water area can be quite small within that because of the spoil that needs to be spread around the area. So having a drawing of the pond itself can be quite useful, just to get that initial agreement, and also in communicating with your digger driver. So a large scale map is good, to scale if possible. And just marking the other water bodies that are around, contours if possible, if you can do a series of rings. So just like this. So you've got your extent of your water, and then you've got the contours of what the water depth will be like within your pond itself. So any other particular features? If you've got no-go areas in particular, so are there particular species that are growing there that we want to avoid that are particularly important, or trees that we want the digger driver to be aware of? Are there buildings, are there archaeological features? That's all really important to just note on a drawing. And okay, so that's the main thing in terms of a drawing. Now, bear in mind that if you're in a site of, not SSAI, what's it called, SPAs or NHAs, or basically ecologically designated sites, then it's really important to keep that in mind and make sure that you work with the National Parks and Wildlife Service if that's needed. So just to keep that in mind. And that's something that Karen and I can follow up with if you have questions about that. So we can check the land maps. Most of you will know if you're in an SAC. So if you are, just, consider it. It doesn't rule it out. It just means that it might need to be done with a little bit more care and thought. Tree felling might need a license, so just keep that in mind. But actually, there shouldn't be any need to fell trees particularly for it. But just keep that in mind, that if you do need to fell trees as part of the project, a license might be needed from that. Planning permission is needed if you're changing the ground level by more than a metre. Bear in mind that 1 Million Ponds is a UK website. So while these are here as pointers, the Irish context is slightly different. Health and safety, just follow the usual health and safety rules that would apply to any construction site. Just do take care, high-vis vests and all the rest of it while you're on site with the digger. Just make sure you can be seen because they can be very dangerous. And if there's protected species in the area, just to keep that in mind. And the other side of protected species is invasive species. If you've got a site with invasive species, be very careful, for example, to really wash down the digger afterwards before he leaves the site or before she leaves the site. And make sure that you're not bringing invasive species out of your site again. That's very important. If you're working in a floodplain, that might need a little bit more care. I can't think of any that we visited that were in floodplains this time around. And services, are there power lines, drains, gas pipes? Those are all really important to consider at this stage, and just try and avoid them if you can completely. So there's 3 general approaches to pond creation. The quick approach, make them over hours or days. That's the approach that we're following at the Hare's Corner. There's a phased approach where if you don't know what the final water level will be like, it might be useful to do your digging in year 1 and then bring a digger back again in subsequent years. And for my pond here in between Ennistimon and the Hinch, that's the approach that I'm taking. We did a glob of work, we got that done, and from here on in, I'm watching water levels and tweaking it a bit, deepening it slightly by playing with some of the pipe work that's there, and possibly getting a digger in again at some stage to broaden out the habitat areas. And then the long-term approach would be where, if you've got a digger on site anytime, just do a little bit more, widen it, broaden it, expand on your wetland habitat range and move forward in that way. But for our purposes here, the quick approach is the one that we'll be doing. We'll be basically digging our pond, walking away and having a pond in our wake. So there's various construction phase issues there to deal with, which just to keep in mind, timing of the works, the end of the summer is generally when the ground is driest. And also the deadline, I believe, is November. So basically we need to have the works done quite quickly in order, just to get it moving in order to make sure that the work is done and the invoices are all in before the project deadline ends, or you might find yourself with the pond dug and no funding there because the whole project has closed and reached its deadline. Make sure that you've got access for machinery, just to keep that in mind. Dealing with spoil is an issue that needs to be considered, and we'll look at that in some of the drawings later on. And dealing with topsoil as well. If the topsoil can just be taken off and removed from the area, then you can use it for your garden or for your farm and not to have it going back into the pond area because of the elevated nutrients, and also not to be wasting it, not to be burying it under bands of subsoil or under a pond liner when you could use it to double your orchard soil depth. Here's Andrew Willison again with the why, where, how. Briefly, he's looking at it from a permaculture perspective and saying that the pond on the top of the hill is actually the most useful in terms of irrigation or power generation or the like, but it's also the one that will hold the least water. for the amount of work that's needed, and you'd need something like a wind pump or something to get the water up there. At the bottom of the site, what he shows really clearly here is that as you move down through the site, your water use will be more limited, but then again, where we're looking at habitat, that doesn't really matter. But the volume of water that you get relative to the size of your dam will be a lot more than further up your catchment. So basically, you get a bigger area lower down in the site for less machine work. That's it essentially. Also, working within a stream valley isn't something that's going to be easy to do because there's often a stream there already rather than just a drain. And Inland Fisheries Ireland permission will be needed. So what you can do instead is you can always take a line off, just a 1-inch hose line. You can see it's dropping down slightly on the contour there into a pond that's dug out, removed from the mainstream channel itself. Or if it's a small valley or just, contour flows within a field, working within the valley can make a lot of sense because it may not be a full stream, it might just be an arm drain, or it might just be seepage within the land, within existing ryegrass context, in which case it's fine. And you can see that the volume of water here is about the same, but the excavation within the channel will be less, or the dam that you need to build will be less than if it's off channel. Now, what you do need to consider is that if you get very heavy rainfall in the channel, you're going to need some sort of a bypass pipe or a bypass line around the outside. You don't want the water spilling over your dam directly, because if it does, it'll just wash away the newly constructed soil that's there. And that's been an experience that I've had here with the silt trap, where in heavy weather, it's just been washed away. So I'm looking at rebuilding that now, which it isn't difficult, but it's just, as your pond consultant, it's a bit embarrassing. That's all. Or a good learning exercise. They said the definition of an expert is somebody who's made lots and lots and lots of mistakes in a very narrow field of endeavor. So those are some of my mistakes. So the construction process. We've got to, let me see. So managing the phases of construction, excavation machinery, just looking at the different machinery to get, excavation method, what do we do? Dealing with the soil that comes out, topsoil, removing that, finishing the site off, documenting the pond construction. You may or may not, well, actually, no, I was going to say you may or may not need to, but for this project, you do need to document it because it's a funded program. So what you should ideally do is take photographs during and after construction, send them on into Karen, and just with a date when it's completed. So that's important. And also, if you want to, you can keep that documentation and just add to it as plants begin to come and record what species begin to arrive. I'll leave these here for your reference rather than anything else, and I'll plow on with the other slides. So let's look very, very briefly at these. If we've got a pond on the level with a high groundwater table, you simply go in, and dig out your pond and remove your soil. You don't want to pile your soil up high on either side because that'll make the area too steep. So remove it at least 3 or 4 meters away from the pond edge if you can at all, and spread it around elsewhere within the field. Ideally, if there's topsoil coming out, you just use that to deepen an area of a garden or an area of an orchard, so you get your better tree growth. You can leave an island in the middle if you wish, or you can make a series of pocket pools all the way around the outer perimeter. And that can be quite large if you want that. So where you've got a slightly, let me say, I'm just going to move the screen that I have here so I can see my own slides. So pond creation using liners is a different process. It's much more time consuming. So basically the cost of your machinery and the cost of your liner will be significant costs. So if a liner is needed, you probably have to spend more on the pond process than the Hare's Corner budget would extend to. But in a nutshell, you dig down as before, lay your liner with great care. Make sure your liner is not taut, not stretched in any location. It's got to be nice and loose in the soil so that when the soil added back in, it doesn't stretch it and pull it taut over a stick or a stone or a hole. Remove sticks and stones and sharps particularly from the area. You can choose to protect it with another sheet of plastic or taram or even carpet or even cardboard, just to provide a bit of protection of it. Cover it back over with a layer of subsoil, about 6 inches to a foot depth of subsoil, right across the full surface to protect it, and also to provide habitat for insects and for frogs. And you can afford to mound up the outside of your pond if it's lined. You're better off not doing that if it's groundwater fed, because you want to keep the water away. Whereas if it's lined, you can lose a certain amount of your spoil around the outer perimeter of the pond. But make sure again that your pond edge slope is nice and gentle. And if you want a seasonal pond, you can just line the base so that your pond, your water level can vary. So in winter, it can come right up to ground level potentially if the soil is relatively heavy or if the groundwater is seasonal. And then during the summertime, then as the water levels drop, it catches on your liner edge and doesn't go down all that much further other than evapotranspiration or evaporation. When you're laying your liner, make sure that your liner edge all the way around the pond is dead level, because otherwise, if you've got your pond liner at different levels, you're going to have a water level that will be at the lowest edge, obviously. And that's a waste of money and materials and resources on all of the liner that was higher than that location. If you've got a pond with a liner on sloping ground, you can dig out your ground, mound it up below the slope and lay your liner within it, and then bring your overflow around the outside of that. There we go. So if you're creating ponds on a sloping site with heavy clay or even peaty soil, you can simply dig it out and mound your clay on the lower side and compact it really, really well. Again, taking great care to keep your edge slopes nice and gentle. Now, something to keep in mind is that ideally what you do first is you clear the topsoil from all of this area. So from under your pond and from under your mound. And the reason for that is twofold. One is to utilize the topsoil elsewhere and to reduce the nutrient status of the area. But the other is really important, and that is that where the grass is growing, if you just cover that with more soil, then there's a direct conduit there for water in through the grass, through the vegetation that will become compacted. Whereas if you remove that grass and topsoil layer and then plug that with clay, you're creating that clay plug which will bind it'll bind your embankment into the gradient, into the slope, and hold everything together much better, and it'll prevent that conduit for water to trickle down through. If you're putting in an island, obviously just leave your island proud in the middle and then do your excavation as before. So the other thing that you can do is you can put your pond into a widened drain. So you can essentially take an existing drain, not a stream, but a seasonal drain would be ideal, and widen it right out to whatever size you need. And that could be quite easy. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that if your drain is very deep and your ground is very high beside it, it's going to cost a lot of money to do that because you're digging down an awfully long way to get to your water level. So this is ideal for a drain that's on a slope, for example, where you've got a head of water above you and you can just make the alterations further down. So do we have a sloping site? We do. So for here on a sloping ground, you can take the level higher up as your pond level and then mound up a dam below your pond, below your drain, and then route your overflow around. Now, do I have an overflow? The overflow is shown here going around away from the old drain channel. What would be better still is to bring your water right around onto existing ground. So you're taking your outlet point further up along your slope and bringing it around onto existing soil. And if that overflow channel can be quite wide, existing wide grass, for example, where there's an existing sward with good root structure within it, then that will all help to prevent erosion as the water makes its way out around. And if you, for tiny ponds, now the Hare's Corner pond should be 5 by 5 roughly. But what you can do as well, if you've got time with the machine left over after you've done your main pond, you can always make small ponds within drainage channels simply by widening the edges slightly and putting in a plug below it. So you're getting all the habitat value, but you're not taking up any of your field or any of your farm with that particular one. And that'll back your water up a good bit within the drain, deepening it slightly and holding a pond within that linear space. So if you've got a peat bog setting, what you can do is you can dig a pool beside the main channel and use that as your plug, rather than widening the main channel per se. Or if you've got several farm drains, one option that you do have is to build a mound right across the field if there's sloping ground, so that all of the water coming down, you can see the direction of flow here at the left, from left to right, all of the water gets contained right within a large, not just a pond area, but re-wetting part of the bogland and reinstating the high groundwater level that would have been there historically. So that can be very, very valuable for a peatland setting. So again, Andrew Millison's point here is that if you've got your pond excavated on your hillside, this is the clay plug that you have particularly a central clay core that's really, really well compacted. And then you can put your looser soil left and right of that. Now he's got a shallow edge slope of 2 to 1. If you can go shallower again, or a steeper edge slope, if you can go shallower than that again, it's better for wildlife. This is more for the permaculture context of growing plants for food or using it for irrigation, like. Okay. So in terms of spoil disposal, if you put spoil up gradient of your pond, if you dig out your pond and put spoil up gradient, it keeps surface water away from the pond. Now, to my mind, that's not necessarily a good thing. Here, in this context, this is actually a groundwater fed pond. And the reason for the spoil bund is to keep polluted water away from the pond. If you're doing that, what I'd strongly suggest is that you make another pond here to filter any water that's coming down, so that as it moves its way down through the landscape, the water is getting cleaner and cleaner. In this context, with clean water ponds, it's to keep the water away. Now, bear in mind that if you've got clean runoff from the upslope area, it's really important that you don't put spoil here, because you don't want to limit the availability of rainfall that runs off the ground and gets into your pond, particularly if it's not a groundwater fed pond, if it's a clay-lined pond that needs that top up in order to thrive. So again, similar to Andrew Millicent's one, if you dig it out, build it up below it to create your pond on the slope. But again, here you can see the vulnerability of that bank. So taking a bypass line around that can be quite important. And again, this is the phased approach that I mentioned. Year 1, dig your main pond, check where your water levels are, and then do your variations in year 2 to 3. Again, with the Hare's Corner, we're doing all our work in phase 1. So make the undulations, see how you go, and then be open to the potential for tweaking it then in subsequent years, just in your own time, if that's something that's interesting to you. In terms of health and safety, the main thing that I'd say is be seen. That's the biggest thing. And the other, in terms of biosecurity safety, if you like, this is a photograph of a zola. It's a floating pond fern, and it grows very rapidly over ponds. You can get it in garden centres, I believe. Still, it's not recommended, and it's one of the invasive species of ponds. And so just be careful where you get your species from. There's quite a lot of invasive species around East Clare, in particular, various different species that really, don't enhance the Irish aquatic environment. And so you've probably seen notices around that at various waterways. So don't take plants from existing pools around East Clare unless they're actually on your land already, and the species are already there. And the recommendation of the 1 million ponds is not to bother with planting at all. So if you've got a series of ponds, that's great. If you can make lots of undulations and the like all the way around it, so much the better. That's an improvement again. There's a process that they call a 1 bucket pond, where they simply just take out a scoop and let it colonize with wildlife. If you're doing that, make sure that it's still gently sloping. You don't particularly want to fall up to your waist in a small little boggy pool. Ideally have just very, very shallow scrapes on the ground, so that the worst that you do is go close to the top of your welly if you happen to step into it by accident. But they can be good for wildlife, just to diversify the area. And they take literally seconds just to excavate when you've got the machine there already. Now, in terms of pond management, I'm just looking at the time and conscious that I need to plow on fairly quickly. So if you've got a stream-fed pond or a drain-fed pond, it will fill up relatively quickly over time. What I've done here, I have one, and what I've done is put in a series of silt traps above the pond, and the other is just have a pond with no inflow, which fills in much more slowly. Managing ponds after you've made them, the recommendation for the UK is don't plant them up. Watch it in the early stages. If bulrush or alien invasive species are colonizing, you may want to take those out. Temporary fencing might be needed if wildfowl or animals are kind of hammering it. Management in later years, I'm going to let you go through those yourself in your own time. The main thing is, once you've got the pond built, it's going to be a useful habitat. So that's the primary focus on it. If you need guidance on planting farm drains in order to provide filtration, there's some here. I'll let you go back to it in your own time if you want to do that, and just take a look over it. And riparian silt traps can be really useful. Planting trees, upgrading into your new pond can be really useful if there's likely to be runoff coming from agricultural land. So plants and planting, I know it recommends not to, I just mentioned some briefly. This is bulrush. I have it growing in my pond. It's very useful because I sell it for reed bed systems and constructed wetlands. So I use it as a commercial crop, but it's also, it can be quite invasive. It grows very, very quickly. And so if you don't want it in your pond, pull it out when you see it first, rather than waiting until it's got well established. It's got rhizomes that grow very quickly underneath the water and can spread very quickly. Common reed is the other one, the one that's used for thatching. That will also grow very, very quickly and very vigorously and very difficult to get rid of after the event. So if you want to keep that little bit more open, it might be worth taking those out in the early years if they become established. Branch burreed is a beautiful plant that can be used. It also grows very thickly and quickly, so you may want to keep an eye on that. It does grow, but it's easier to get rid of. And yellow flag iris is a beautiful plant, very nice wetland plant that's good for pollinators and for wildlife generally, and that can be used. A lot of people around the area have that growing on farm already. Watermint is a lovely one, wonderful pepperminty smell that comes off it. Watercress is another one. If you have too much typha, if you've got too much of this one, you can eat it. You can eat the growing tip, and you can tap out the pollen apparently to add to bread and the like as a high protein source. But apparently there's more starch in an acre of typha than there is in an acre of spuds. So who knows? I know that it's being used in polludiculture in the Midlands at the moment for trials for various things, or being explored and used in Germany. So some pond examples. This is a large pond just north of the tunnel underneath the Shannon. So this is a large series of ponds and lakes that were dug. And the main thing that I designed into this one is the islands are star-shaped so that wherever the wind is coming from, waterfowl can shelter behind them. And also the edge slopes are very, very shallow. So we've got a wonderfully wide margin all the way around the outer perimeter. This is a pond in UL. It's a stormwater pond and a great habitat for wildlife already. This is a pond down in Cork, done kind of on the QT as part of another project that I was working on. So we managed to spend a day with a digger and flood the area and get a pond in there, which was a great bonus for the project. And even tiny ponds can be built along roadsides. If you know what you're doing, just build small little dams, plant behind them, and you've got a series of pocket pools. But these are mostly for water filtration. So in the terms of the Hare's Corner, this is one of the ponds from last year's project. And so you can see the liner has been really well hidden. There's lovely gentle gradients at the side. There's no plants in it. It's fine. It's coming out. There's grasses, but they'll come over time. So just be patient and wait for them to emerge. And similarly here, this is a groundwater fed pond. Again, we've got, it's a lovely small little pocket pool that'll do its thing for wildlife. There'll be scope for both wildlife and for amenity as well, just being beside it. And even if you're in an urban, not an urban garden, but this particular garden had a lot of gravel in the area. It was spread out over a yard. And rather than eating into the habitat within the wider area, the habitat is kind of rolling back in and encroaching into the gravel area, which I quite like. This is one of the, if it'll load up, this is one of the larger ponds that we have. And this is near Ina. And you can see there's a steep bank at one side. And the reason for that steep bank is it's part of the boundary area with the neighboring property. And just both to protect that and also a place to get rid of a lot of the spoil that was excavated. The gradient up here at the left-hand side is quite steep. So getting rid of a lot of the spoil at the other side is quite useful. And yet we do have a very gentle gradient here. So wildlife can still get in and out easily. And these islands are seasonal. So as the water rises, the islands will become islands. As the water goes down, they re-emerge again. So we've got that seasonal variation that can be quite useful for wildlife. And then this is the pond that I put in. It was put in at the same time frame. There was a marsh area to one side. So the establishment rate was very, very quick. And the trees were actually already growing. So what we did was we dug out around the trees. So the whole thing established very quickly. This photograph was also taken about 6 months after a lot of the others. So it's kind of an unfair comparison. But I'm really pleased with it. It's a lovely one. There's the herons and mallards coming into it. So in summary, very, very briefly, do choose a nestled location with a good catchment area. Assess your soil type and your likely water inputs to see how much it's likely to hold. You might want to use a plastic liner. Plan your pond, draw your design, plan a larger dig than the finished area, because basically once you've done all your digging, your pond will inevitably be a bit smaller than the total area that you dig out. So just keep that in mind. Make the edge very shallow, allow for seasonal variation in depth if you can. Hide the plastic liner under 4 to 6 inches of subsoil to protect it and also for greater wildlife. Make sure the liner, if you use one, is laid loose. Really protect the liner as it's going in, and don't dream of going back in on top of the liner with a machine afterwards, because that will just puncture it straight away. Hand remove vigorous plants and enjoy the process. Enjoy the wildlife, peace and quiet, and the rippling sunlight on the water. And avoid flooding your neighbours. Don't go blocking drains if it's going to flood back into neighbouring ground. And don't go making huge dams in a busy stream or a busy drain that can run the risk of breaking and flooding people downstream. That's really important. Don't create a safety hazard with steep edges or surfaces hidden by vegetation. And avoid removing good habitat. Avoid native woodlands and species-rich grasslands and existing wetlands. Don't make the pond edges too regular. Don't dig too deep. And when you're placing excavated subsoil on the upper side of your pond, avoid placing it on the upper side of your pond, because this will divert away the runoff water that you might want in order to keep your pond topped up. Avoid damaging plastic liners, so take care with that. And avoid rushing to plant it too much. I've spoken about that already a number of times. And avoid overthinking it. Don't overthink it. It's not rocket science. There are things that you need to keep an eye on, but it's much, much better to get the digger in, dig your pond, have it there for wildlife, and maybe tweak it next year, rather than to be endlessly doing drawings and more drawings. And this is I love this one in the context of health and safety. This is my daughter bouncing up and down on a bridge, which is part of a cycle path in an urban area in Denmark. And I think that I just love the approach that says, yeah, put it there. And some kids will cycle around it if they're not comfy, and some will just whiz straight over the top on the way to school. And, and that's what it is, put in by the local county council. And I love it, I'm smitten. And so there we go. So I'd welcome any questions that you might have. And thanks for your attention up to now.
That was brilliant, Feidhlim. As always, thanks a million. Great. Yes, we have a question from Anna. She's asking, I don't know if you can see it as well, Feidhlim, but I'll read it out for you anyway. She just says, can you just confirm the pond should not be more than 1 meter deep, which is true, exactly, both due to being beneficial for wildlife and that you don't need planning permission for a pond less than 1 meter. So roughly speaking, the pond is between 50 centimeters to 1 meter deep on the deepest point with soft slope edges.
Yeah, that sounds good. Is there a question there, or is it?
That was just to confirm.
Just to confirm. Oh yeah, that's about right. That's about right. One thing to bear in mind is that if your pond, you can actually have a 2 meter deep pond or a 1.9 meter deep pond without planning permission, because you can dig down and you can build up. So if you're on a slope, you can dig down nearly 1 meter and build up nearly 1 meter. And so you can get quite a deep pond if that's what you're looking for, without encroaching upon that particular planning requirement. But in terms of wildlife, yeah, wildlife will be in the busy few centimeters at the very top. So from a wildlife perspective, really shallow edge slope is really good. So let me see, is that still there? Answer just confirm. So yeah, but basically, Anna, you're absolutely right. So 50 centimeters to 1 meter at the deepest point is about right. And then very, very gentle gradient around the outside. If it's shallow, in more invasive, more vigorous species will encroach more. They'll encroach more quickly and they'll encroach more enthusiastically. And that's not the end of the world. You may want to pull them out as you go along.
Great, Feidhlim, thanks. There's another question here. Remember this site, actually. What can we expect regarding bugs like mosquitoes and midges? They're great. Our pond will be about 100 meters from the house.
Okay, 100 meters, 100 meters I think is fine.
Yeah.
We have a pond, we're in an area with a lot of wetland habitats anyway. We get horseflies, which I dislike with some enthusiasm. As an enthusiastic wetland builder and advisor and all that, I must confess I really do not like horseflies. But bats do, and swallows do. And as I look at the insect numbers plummeting, I'd much, much rather have horseflies than not have an insect base in the country at all. 100 meters, I wouldn't worry about it. You know, yeah, I wouldn't fret.
Me neither. No. Thanks, Feidhlim. Fergus is asking, can humans be included as wildlife? In other words, can ponds be used for occasional bathing and also support wildlife diversity?
They can, yeah. And the more, if you use your pond all the time, if you're there hanging out by the pool every day, day in, day out, it's not going to be as interesting for the heron that will fly over and come looking for frogs, you know, nor for the frogs. But at the same time, I think one of the things that I really strongly believe is that one of the reasons why we're up the creek in terms of biodiversity and the state of the planet is because we've become divorced from what's around us. You know, we think we're separate from one another. We think we're separate from the environment itself. If anybody thinks we're separate from the environment, just, you know, stop breathing for just 5 minutes. You know, just 5 minutes, that's all. And separate yourself from the environment that little bit more. You know, and that's obviously not a runner, it's not a recommendation. Kids, do not try this at home. Not without lots of practice. So you know, yeah, by all means.
I guess the solution is to build multiple ponds.
Far
exactly. Away from your house.
Exactly, that's the thing. I was in Cloughjordan teaching their water course yesterday, and there was a cherry tree, and it had cherries on it. I've never managed to see red cherries on a cherry tree because they all got taken by blackbirds. And the secret is that there's not just one cherry tree, it's a cherry tree amidst a sea of plums and apples and blackcurrants and gooseberries that are planted all over the public space. So similarly, if we've got loads of ponds, if you go swimming in one of them, the heron flies away, it'll fly down to the next pond. And not to worry about it. And maybe if you want to really contribute to wildlife, don't swat that horsefly, just let it have a good drink and move on to the next bar.
Yes. All right, another question. What should I be looking for in a liner, material, etc.? I am going to send round loads of information tomorrow, including the link to this recording on YouTube, but also liner information. So don't worry, that's all coming. But if you want to comment on that, Feidhlim, go ahead.
Cool, I'm conscious we're low on time. But yeah, liners, if you can get away with that one, fantastic. You know, if you manage to have soil that's heavy enough clay that it can hold water or peat. I know it says don't dig on peat, but if you've got loads of peaty soil in the area, putting in a pond is probably better than not. If the alternative is forestry or farmland, a pond is better than that from a wildlife point of view. So let me see. 1 mil LDPE or EPDM is a very, very good liner, but it's also very expensive. And I've seen silage plastic used successfully. I've also seen silage plastic and builder's plastic fail. So care is needed. You know, if you've got it, yeah, it's kind of nuanced. You know, if you've got the budget, a good heavy duty EPDM or LDPE liner can be really, really useful. But preferably work with the landscape if you can, and work on existing clay or existing peat.
That's great. I think we're through our questions. If nobody else has questions, I'm going to end this webinar. Thank you so much, Feidhlim. That was fantastic. I'm sure, listen, let this all sink in, guys. And if you have any questions, let us know. You know where to find me, Karen@barnbio.com. And I will make sure that Feidhlim gets all your questions as well. Thank you so much for coming. Feidhlim, thanks again so much for doing this. Fingers crossed we'll get loads and loads of ponds back in Clare.
Brilliant.
All right. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks a million, Karen. It's great.